Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin Graham. I'm a Managing Director at Oppenheimer, run technology investment banking. A very important part of that is education and education technology investing. I'm very aware of the fact that our panel here today is between you and drinks. So we'll make it fun and lively to keep everyone awake before the alcohol gets to your hands. Very excited to introduce this panel. The topic of the panel here is a path to $1 trillion education technology company. And I think the first response from my panelists as we were getting prepared was Richard on the end there, who said, somebody must be smoking something in California. So if they think they're going to get to $1 trillion in education technology, but that's what we're going to explore. So let me just introduce each of the panelists. On the far end there, Richard Sarnoff with KKR, who's chairman of media and education investing. To his right is Cecilia Qvist, who runs Lego Ventures and is a partner there. She's going to tell us about their mandate in education investing. Next to her is Mercedes Bent, partner with Lightspeed Venture Partners, heads their education practice. And then Fazeela Abdul Rashid is to my left, managing director at Temasek. And in looking at this panel, GSV did a fantastic job of putting together this group of investors. I think this group of investors could probably take somebody from seed stage to $1 trillion. So we're going to explore how. A little bit of background on each of you and your fund mandates. Maybe I'll ask Cecilia to start, because you might be the earliest stage investor on the panel. Why is Lego investing in education, and what is different about your approach?
So being Lego is kind of a really, really cool thing, going back to our narrative, right? So I don't know how many of you know, but it's still a privately owned company, and we are turning 90 years next year. So our background in education and those type of kind of data points has been as the interception of Lego. So for us, that's kind of the core of what we do. And as we think about it, we have different entities within the ecosystem, where Lego Venture is the investing arm of looking for new technologies, new way of seeking out the next generation of education companies and digital play companies that have that element to it. So it's a really exciting opportunity on what we're doing. But I think one of the things that I'm excited, why I was also excited to join, is the fact that this is a company that have had this at its core since inception, and that was 90 years ago. So there is some incredible data that we can also kind of take and apply to the next phase of the education sector.
What was the phrase you used, Cecilia, when we spoke? It was funding the builders of tomorrow, or something like that. I really like that. It's very catchy.
To found and develop the builders of tomorrow, that has been kind of the narrative of Lego since the start. And I think it's very few companies that can say that they have kept the same mission since they started, and it's still relevant today. I think it's just the form and the nature that has changed over time. So the brick is still a big part of what we do. And I mean, when I was small, I played with Lego when I learned math, as an example. Yep. But today, and how technology specifically is reaching consumer directly, and that's kind of what we're focusing on to bring that to the world.
Great, thanks, Cecilia. Mercedes, maybe I can ask you, you and your venture partners are hugely successful in venture investing at Lightspeed, backing companies like Snapchat, who scaled massively. What opportunity do you see in education, and why are you at Lightspeed investing in this particular sector? Where do you and your partners see the opportunity?
Well, I hope we all share a lot of this in common, since we're all here at ASU+GSV. But I mean, you guys know the stats on the education industry. It's one of the largest in the world by both the number of people in the industry and the overall dollars that go into it globally. And so when we think about where do you get the biggest returns, a lot of times it's where there's the biggest market size. And so, I think it's also one of the least digitally penetrated industries of many out there, similar to healthcare. There's a lot of dollar spend that goes to instruction and that goes to staffing. And so, and until last year, there was a lot of inertia in terms of bringing in more technology in the way that we've seen other industries completely revolutionize. So when I put those two up against each other, I say, okay, huge market, low digital penetration, that's opportunity. And so if I was just taking the business sense, that would be it. But of course, there's always a personal and a mission story as well. You know, my grandparents were HBCU professors. My mom was a community college professor. And so education's always been super deep in our family. And so when I came to Lightspeed, I said, y'all got to let me invest in this. And they agreed.
That's great. So what stage are you generally investing?
I'm typically investing fairly early to mid. I'd say I do check sizes 3 million to 30 million or so. So seed to Series B.
Great, thanks. And Cecilia, you're seed and Series A, right?
So from Series A, actually,
Series
and
A.
onwards, and we can, follow through the whole cycle, going back to your point as you're starting, and also in terms of Richard. So following on all the way.
Wonderful, thanks. Well, maybe I'll ask Fazeela to just tell us a little bit about Temasek. Now, Temasek's an interesting fund. Most people have heard of it. It's sort of an enigma. You show up with big checks. Tell us a little bit about what's unique about Temasek and your investment style in education.
Yeah, sure. First, pleasure to be here, and I think there is a thread between what Cecilia said and what Mercedes said, and we sit somewhere in between that thread, right? I think for us, as I would describe Temasek, our mission in many ways is investing today with tomorrow in mind. That's how we think about investing. So we consider ourselves generational stewards of capital, but at the same time, catalytic capital, right? So when we think about the opportunity set, given that we are a permanent capital vehicle and we don't have a fund life, we can start thinking about sectors and opportunity sets in quite a different way. So when I see where we sit a little bit around the education opportunity, very, very similar to what Mercedes described. There's a lot of opportunity to, transform an industry which is already extremely large. It is, to some degrees, we can talk about how much is global and how much is not global, but there is a lot that can be globalized and carried through. So when we sit and we say, can we build companies of scale that can carry across multiple geographies, that can transform itself and need long-term stewards of capital to figure out how they drive that growth, we quite nicely fit into that equation as you think about your journey. So that's how Temasek sort of, and I'll echo the mission concept, right? If we're generational stewards and we're thinking mission is very much so, and if anyone's followed Temasek, we started talking a lot about our mission-driven approach, sustainability, ESG as forefronts of how we think about our capital and how we want to invest into the future. So this fits squarely in all of that.
Any particular stage in the evolution that
Yeah, so I'd say we come actually right behind these two guys in the sense that we are more Series B, Series C, but all the way to, and Richard will talk about where KKR, and we will partner with folks like KKR in buyouts, and we will anchor IPO. So we kind of carry the capital through, I think, late stage venture, early growth.
That's great. I can see some partnerships forming on this panel already. So Richard, last but not least, you've been a prolific investor, both personally and professionally, across the education landscape for a while now. KKR is one of the world's biggest fund complexes. What do you guys see in the sector? How do you move the needle on a fund as big as KKR in the education space?
Well, first, I just want to say I thought I was here mostly for gender diversity in the panel, so I wasn't aware I'd have to actually answer any questions. But the fact is that KKR, as an entity, has been an investor in the education field for many years, but along with the EdTech sector itself, it has accelerated its participation and its interest. In a lot of ways, education, if you go back a few decades or even just 5 years, has been a get-rich-slow scheme. Where you really needed to have a lot of patience because of the nature of the buyer universe and how sticky it was, whether you're talking higher ed or K-12, even in the corporate sector. With the advancement of technology and certainly with the crisis of COVID, it has become a little bit more of a get rich in an accelerated fashion scheme. And many people in this hall have participated in that, benefited from that. But on the investor side, it also means these companies are moving faster. They're magnetizing value faster, they're magnetizing capital faster, but they're moving faster to a bigger destination. And I think we all see that. So when KKR has looked recently at some of the deals that we've done, whether it's EuroKids or Education Perfect or Teaching Strategies or even Overdrive and Canopy into Overdrive, we see the same kinds of trends that you've heard from the other panelists here. But what we see is this sort of different pace in the industry that has created a ferment of both activity and valuation, but also a ferment of change in buying activity in a environment that was really hidebound for a long time. And that's what's exciting about this, and that's why we can even think about stuff like a $1 trillion company going forward.
Well, now that you've self-identified with me as the skeptic on the panel, Richard, is it possible to get to a $1 trillion education technology company in the next 10 years?
In the next 10 years? Well, I'd answer that to say, first of all, it's not really even a question. It's already been done. If you look at Apple or Google or Microsoft, they're all $1 trillion companies. They're all in education, maybe not as their core business, but certainly in a significant way. If you guys want to figure out, how to fix a faucet, do you go to YouTube first? Yeah. Is that education? Yeah. Is that owned by Google? Yeah. So I think the fact is we do have $1 trillion companies already in education. Whether you get a pure EdTech company to achieve that kind of valuation and status, I think, yeah, there's a possibility. But what I'd say, if I can take one more minute with this answer, is that each of those companies I mentioned, ends up being essentially an interface company. Your interface to work is Microsoft. Your interface to shopping is Amazon. Your interface to communication is Apple. What is the interface company for education? What does that look like? How do you build it? I'm also co-chair of CHEG. There are some companies of size that are trying to build something that may look like that eventually, but I would say we are a pretty long way from that, and we need a lot of crystallization of different parts of this ecosystem coming together, building something that is even more overwhelming in terms of the value to the consumer of education than we have now, to get anywhere near that kind of number.
So who gets to 50 billion first, if not $1 trillion?
Oh, 50 billion. Hey, Chegg has line of sight to that right now. Are you kidding?
Getting close, yes. So setting some of the goals aside, I just want to ask our panelists, we can talk about the laudable goal and argue about whether we're there already with diversified plays in technology companies that do education, or whether there's a pure play out there that can scale to that size over time. But it really comes down to what are the attributes of a company that could get to that size and scale. So setting the goal aside, GSV comes up with a really interesting construct for looking at investing in companies, which is Mike Moe's 5 Ps, people, potential, purpose, product, and I forget the 5th one. Predictability. I forgot that one, of course. So, if we're thinking about, purpose, Cecilia, you talk about the purpose behind your investing style at Lego Ventures. Purpose being the sort of alignment between economic incentive and the meaning of and the intent of the business that's perhaps altruistic. Can you tell us a little bit about how your investing style in Lego Ventures in an interesting company that could scale to that size meets those needs as well, not just the economic incentives, but the purpose behind it?
Well, I think there's a few things. So when we look at companies, so going back, it has to be an idea that resonates on a global scale, like learning through play for us, right? That's kind of the lens we look at investments. But at the end of the day, there's a few things that we are really passionate about, and that goes back to the founders of the company, and I think we all will testament to that. How do they think about things? How do they stack rank? And I think there's a few things that I've learned throughout the years, at least, that you have to always over-index on great people. And if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what you have on the paper, right, on what you're going to do. I think the other part is when you have those great people in the company, good founders, they know how to articulate the mission. What are they going for? What are they not going for? Equally important. Because I think at the early stage, when you go from this building phase to scaling to the unicorn phase and potentially coming to those type of companies like Chegg, there is different problems to be solved. But going back to that the founder can articulate the vision so the autonomy exists in the organization in the context that they are building. That's kind of the things that we look at. Of course, and then scalable technology, content distribution, all of those things. But at the end of the day, through the lens of learning through play, an idea that resonates on a global scale, and that's also why I would like to see, and we would like to see, some kind of product market fit as a starting point, that you actually proved your thesis, so you can be that scalable company. And to the point that you're making, there is already great companies out there, but not with the lens of an EdTech company, and with the jump in technology, kind of attracting the consumer directly, and not jumping all of the steps that we had before. It's going to be interesting to see what the future looked like, because I don't think any of us, if we knew that, we would have tons of companies in our portfolio that we don't have today. But when we extrapolate the curve, what will that be? And I think that's some of the things that we are all thinking about on a daily basis.
Yep. That's great, thanks. Just moving down the P list here, Fazeela, you and I spoke a little bit about the people involved in a scalable business like this. What kind of founder CEO DNA is really necessary to scale a business to that size? What do you look for as an investor in the teams that you are investing in that gives you confidence that you could invest in a business that could be potentially $1 trillion value?
Yeah, sure. I think one key thing for us, and because we always try to solve of building companies at global scale, right? For us, we always test companies and founders around how audacious do you think about the opportunity set that is at your table. You may have the building blocks today of product A, but the truth is, what can that product A be, and how can it be extended into verticals, into horizontal sort of platforms, and having the foresight to sort of think ahead of what that could look like, recognizing you don't want to do all of that at once. So you've got to have this sort of unique balance of focus and audaciousness, right? And then on the flip side, I think you also need to know what you don't know and who you surround yourself with, right? And this goes back to the point of people. You as a founder, and we see this especially with this acceleration in EdTech, you're seeing a lot of founder-driven companies get to scale quite quickly now. And then the question is, who do you surround yourself with so you get beyond 100 and you can see a line of sight to building a 500, $1 billion. Then we start talking about scale in a different way. Geography is a perfect example for us. How do you tackle a market like Asia, which is disparate and different from selling in the US, for example? And so these are some of the things we test out pretty early on when we're sort of talking to the company, and that interaction with the senior management team gives us some sense of, is there a line of sight to really building a global business of true scale?
There's an old saying that says, no man is an island. Within an organization, surrounding yourself with the right people is the point you're making. What about outside the organization? Is a company an island, or do you really need to have strong partnerships in the ecosystem to scale? Yeah,
it's interesting, and Richard, you pointed this out, right? The interface, I think, becomes an interesting point here. When you look at the opportunity set in EdTech and education more broadly speaking today, you'll see different paths of, you could be a hybrid company, you could be a pure online company, you could be an entertainment-driven company, but do you need to build all of that yourself? Partnerships are important. M&A is probably another driver, but there are different ways and different building blocks to get to that. And so thinking more expansively around partnerships, around, who else can you leverage? And this is where we try to drive that conversation. We say, look, we have portfolio companies in our consumer platform, in our media platform. Like, you can take learnings from there, you can partner with them. You shouldn't be building everything yourself. So I think thinking that expansively is really helpful for scale quickly too.
Yeah, very important in today's global market. Thanks. Mercedes, product. Let's talk about product. You, as most people may know if they read your bio, spent some time as a product manager before you became an investor. What are the attributes of a product that could be scalable inside a company with this momentum? Obviously, market-leading product, proprietary and patented. But how would you think, as somebody who's experienced in product, about the right company product fit with a market like the education space?
Yeah, I think that the product is extremely important. I mean, to think about, one of the things we always look for when we're investing is whether or not they're creating habits. When you spoke about the interfaces companies, those are all habits. Every single time we think of Googling, we go to Google. When we think of shopping, we go to Amazon. It's become so instilled, and it's become also something that we engage with at a really high amount. And so anybody who's building a product needs to really aim for, whether it's enterprise or consumer, extreme engagement. And so we are looking, when we're investing at companies that have, DAU MAUs that are pretty high. We're looking at, or DAU over MAU, daily active user over monthly active user. We're looking to really understand, is that engagement there? It doesn't always have to be a daily use case. It could be a weekly use case. We might look at that. But the attributes of the product are ones that bring people back continuously. And so you also see that reflected in the retention, and you'll see those really high retention rates. I think the product also has to create a magic moment for people. Products can be extremely smart, but it has to be a 10x better experience than whatever they were using before. And so that means that people need to have that, it just works moment, Look at Zoom. I mean, we all use it every day now, and there's been tons of different video conferencing platforms over the years, but everyone just liked when they clicked that button, it just worked. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten my Skype username and login, and I still can't get into the platform. And so, from a product perspective, you just have to make it incredibly easy for people to understand and sticky. I think if you aim for those two things, then you'll really have a lasting product.
Yeah, we've all experienced that with Zoom. I mean, ultimately, we were all enabled, or most of us were enabled with Cisco WebEx before Zoom came along. And marginally better UI and customer experience really drove incredible adoption and has created massive amounts of market value. They're now obviously building a software suite behind that, which is kind of interesting. But that begs the question: is this company that we're thinking about or hypothesizing about here necessarily a B2C company? Does anybody have an opinion on that, or is it a B2B company, or all things to all people to get to that kind of scale?
Well, I'll go after that. I think it pretty much should be a B2C company because and I'll add a P here as well, which is persistence. I think what we've found here is
Mike Mo's taking notes in the back.
Okay.
He's adding it to, he's changing it to 6 Ps.
Yeah. You want to have 7 of something anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Get another one. The truth is to have persistent business models in atmospheres that are as government dominated in terms of spend as education or healthcare really takes, I think it shines much more easily in the consumer market than it does in any B2B context. Certainly corporate and training is going to be a giant market. I just don't know if you get $1 trillion type of value out of that. That really needs a wider consumer and wider global orientation. But I think when you look at persistence here, and you can see this in ByteDance, for example, which we're an investor in, and what happened to them in China, there are points at which people don't want everything to be for-profit and private in certain countries, in certain situations, or where it seems awkward, where we really do need to have the mission have primacy over the profit motive. And to navigate those waters is pretty tricky when you get to this scale of company, because it's going to involve consumers everywhere spending a lot of money on something that is very important and that the government had typically either subsidized or provided to those consumers at no cost. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I would say, we should look on the consumer side rather than the B2B side.
Anyone else have a counterpoint to that? So, scalable product, B2C, some of the attributes of a $1 trillion company. Mercedes has something to say. I
mean, I agree, but my cheeky counterpoint is that, any of these companies are not going to only monetize through B2C. So what do you really mean by B2C? In terms of every company that's going to reach the scale of trillions of dollars is going to be selling into enterprise, and they're going to also have a really amazing consumer product. So it'll be both.
Yeah, but I think I would echo the point that it has to have a stickiness to the customer, that the customer wants it because it just hooks them, right? So whether you sell B2B, the customer is the final decision maker and what drives, I think, wanting this product. And I would echo Richard's comment around, this dynamic around for-profit and non-for-profit and regulatory dynamics becomes quite convoluted and difficult to navigate in the world of education, which is why the B2C construct or the B2B2C construct, I think, is where you would really be able to see scale without too much friction. So
let's unpack that a little bit, because Richard, you mentioned something that Fazeela now just picked up on. We've all been surprised by the government weighing in on online tutoring in China, and it's had a big impact on market value of companies that were, scaling well into the billions in market value. Private companies we thought were going to come public on U.S. exchanges and Hong Kong exchange. Is this endemic in the EdTech? Will we always face these kinds of barriers? And what are the other points of friction in scaling to $1 trillion market value? Is education just a public good that the government's always going to swoop in and take a hand in? Or can you really, as capitalists, fund and see a company grow to that kind of scale without government intervention?
Well, I think we ought to hear from the Nordic model on that.
Yeah. Good point.
But I think this is a really interesting point, and it comes back to understanding the narrative of the country as such, right? So we do touch a little bit on China and, what has happened there. But if you look at, accessibility and the model as such, I do think that intervention, you can look at many of the sectors, like the healthcare sector, we're talking about the financial sector. In one shape or form, the government will interfere, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's also up to us as investors, as business leaders, to kind of solve for that problem. And I think one of the things that I spent quite a lot of time the past years is also on education in terms of talking to the regulators in terms of how does this model actually fit into the bigger ecosystem, because many of them who's putting out the regulations, they are solving for one problem. And I think this is the thing with technology, it doesn't respect any borders. So you can actually solve for all of them, but then you come into payments methods, you come into curriculum, you come into a lot of things. So I think we also have an obligation as an industry to be a voice of that and talk to what technology is actually doing and what we're trying to solve for, and having that dialogue, because the regulatory framework will come. That's kind of, if you look at any of the other businesses or sectors that has been successful over time, and going back to how important education is for all of us. And I think with what we have seen now with COVID as well, when you have had 1.2 billion kids out of the classroom for quite some time, what will that do to equity and equality? So for me, that we have governments and other institutions interfering and looking at this problem is just kind of natural to me.
All I was going to say, it's and I think it's useful to have a fully global perspective on this, but it's up to the people in this room and outside this room to provide the kind of overwhelming value for the dollar that can essentially change the terms of the debate when government decides to weigh in, so that there just can't be an argument against the provision of the kinds of goods and services that we can provide digitally, and the effects that those have on the performance of a new generation of kids and a generation of workers and a generation of anyone else. If we really have overwhelming value for the dollar, that does kind of take the government out of the equation. And so, it's kind of a challenge for all of us to figure out how to do just that.
I was going to say, I kind of almost want to put aside the title of this and say there's a lot of ways to build a business and make money in education, right? And when you think about the problems that need to get solved, if you encumber yourself by saying, I want to be purely a certain type of business, I'm not going to go into curriculum, I'm not going to deal with government, we go back to all of us are investing in this area because there's a mission-driven element to it. And when I step back as who we are as Temasek in Singapore, we balance that because there's a strategic element with what we do, right? I want to engage with companies who are building access on workforce reskilling, in trade, in areas where technology can be an enabler. And the truth is, you can still build a big business. Like, do you need to be $1 trillion business? Let's put that aside. But you can be a business of scale and well-funded and monetized, et cetera. But you do, as you point out, I think in certain categories of where you are, and bring the parties alongside you, right? And actually sometimes investors can be helpful. I won't say China is a unique situation, but I can say that at least where we sit, given the relationships that we have with certain governments, we try to drive and have those conversations early on to help companies say, this is what we're bringing in when we're building a company into your country or into your part of the world.
Sort of what Cecilia was saying, which is basically it's incumbent on us all and you as investors to advocate for the benefits of private education solutions to governments and make that lesson sink in, to use a pun.
Well, and I think it's not either or, right? So we will have lots of new things kind of coming out of this. So going back to the point that we're all making, create the value, talk to your counterparts, try to kind of convey what you're trying to solve for, and over time that will be the right way of doing it, because we are all here to build sustainable businesses over time. Yeah. And none of these trillion-dollar companies is made overnight. What everybody thinks is like, it doesn't happen. It takes a lot of time, persistence, failure, but I do just think that we are all better off if we have that dialogue fairly upfront. And I think that's what I see in companies that have been successful. They dare to engage in also in this a little bit more, tricky problems, because it's not money generating as a starting point, but it will get you there faster at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes sense. When it comes down to it, I mean, you've got the education industry sort of breaks down roughly into 3 or 4 different segments. You've got K through 12, you've got higher ed, and then you've got lifelong learning or reskilling, as Fazeela and I discussed the other day. And there's different opportunities in all of those, and different levels of government intervention and points of friction in building businesses in each one of those segments. Maybe I could ask Mercedes, which one of those 3 areas do you think, the next high-growth, scalable startup comes out of, and why?
Definitely career mobility, adult learning, the later side of it. I'm biased. I've worked mostly in this space for most of my life, but when you think about how the dollar is spent, and at least I'm talking in the US, because I do think in India and China, we actually see the opposite, maybe where there's going to be more dollars spent going into K-12. But in the US, the propensity to spend and dollars go more have historically gone much more to the companies that are training people, that are thinking about what's the cost per hire, is that 4,000, 10,000, the ACVs that you see get up into the $1 million contracts, the companies are getting to these billion, the companies that are getting to the $1 billion scales are companies that have been like Coursera, and people that have been like Instructure, and companies that have Pluralsight, different ones that have served the reskiller or the learner, or the higher education learner. That's my bias to it. I do think when you look, the US is changing extremely rapidly right now. The, amount of money that parents are willing to spend and discretionary income on their kids just changed dramatically overnight. So there is a possibility where in the US we could have, companies where supplemental spend, tutoring spend, obviously there's Chegg, could be a company that would make it where we could see many more billion-dollar companies.
Is that a global phenomenon? Is it the U.S. and China's had, a huge emphasis on education of their sort of only children for a long time, right? Do you see that happening in India and other large economies?
Well, we're investors in Byju's as well, and that was started out of India, and that one's a decacorn. So I think you definitely see the companies that are, working on tutoring, supplemental education, that when there is that big propensity to spend, we definitely see that in India. And then it's not just India too. I mean, Byju's is now a global company, and they're, in different countries around the world. So we do see it a lot more, but I think the US has just historically been behind on that spend level.
Fazeela, do you agree? I mean, is lifelong learning and reskilling the biggest, most scalable opportunity in the market?
I think with the companies we see today, yeah, I'd say that is also because you can carry that person's willingness to pay from the higher ed and then on through, whether it's B2C or, whether companies are engaging with these platforms to be able to extend that content platform. I mean, the one idea that has sort of we've been noodling around and thinking about is there's so much around how kids today engage with games and entertainment, and how they think of entertainment as learning. And we're seeing more and more companies come and think about solutions in that way that are B2C platforms. Now, have we seen anything to scale? Not a ton, but when I think about where this could go in that, K to 12 targeted to, kids in a very differentiated way. So for example, we're an investor in Roblox. What could Roblox look like when you add, learning into that platform. So when I start thinking about just very differentiated ways of how you engage with students, not in the curriculum at home, but in just how they spend their time, that could be some interesting companies that could come out on that K-12 side and engaging particularly U.S. consumers, because I would fully agree with you. We've seen, where spend is on like after-school tutoring very different overseas versus the U.S.
Yeah, that's the area Cecilia is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We can go to Lego, which may have some things to say about that, but I would tend to agree, and maybe the premise of the question needs to be reframed a little bit from those, three mostly demographic-oriented market segments to something that's just a little bit more, how are people being educated in the future? Are they being educated in physical spaces, or are they being educated in virtual spaces? We've seen, and we talked about Zoom a little bit, and it's high time someone said metaverse on one of these panels, so I'll say it.
So inherent in Roblox.
Yeah, Roblox is there. We're an investor in Epic Games, which does Fortnite, and the CEO there is in many ways the progenitor of the current thesis of the metaverse, Tim Sweeney. And one could imagine that if we go forward 10 years, the context of education has changed an awful lot, and most of it happens in virtual space, and most of it happens with your avatar, and most of it happens, with the cohorting that typically happens in these kinds of games, rather than in the traditional classroom settings, whether it's corporate or school or college, as we see today. And there are a lot of ways that metaverse concept could be far more effective for education at all of these age groups than any of the other models that we have today. So I'll turn it over to Lego here to...
No, but that's kind of, how I think. So if I think about what I'm most excited about when it comes to education, it's the gamification of education, to all of the points that you point to. And then you can argue, what is the metaverse? You will probably have 10,000 different answers. But my point being that if you look at how kids consume today, and on and off classroom to that point, I think that's how you will capture that audience. And going back to the purpose-driven investment, how do you actually make sure that you get that accessibility and the equity and equality? Because that access exists in that way. And if you look at some of the companies that will come out here shortly on that topic, I think they're doing very, very interesting things. And what is it, like 2.5 billion people playing some type of game in some kind of form? I mean, it's a huge market. So if you just compare it and with some to the media industry, you have media, you have music, but then you look at the gamification of education, that's like this. Yeah. So I think that's going back to what do you provide to the consumer in that sense. So for us, there is some really interesting parts there that we are also hoping to talk a little bit more in the future.
Sounds like it all comes down to making learning fun.
It's all about making it fun for us, right?
Yeah.
Learning through play.
Between the two of you, you account for about 12 hours of my 12-year-old son's day, by the way. So thank you for that, and a growing percentage of our disposable income. So we want to end with the seventh P. Richard, you labeled the sixth. The seventh is partnership. We've got some very laudable funds here, each investing at different stages in the growth cycle of a company naturally. How do you all partner with one another to provide the kind of ecosystem support to the next trillion-dollar business from formation all the way through to that market value? Who wants to take that?
We mark up each other's deals. I mean, we're investors in Epic Games, you are as well. I'm sure we have a lot of other ones as well. But I mean, the market's just growing faster and faster too. I think, our companies are 10xing in valuation in 1 year now and that's when they're going from hundreds of millions to billions. And so I think just when you think about the time it takes to get to these big $1 billion, it's less. So we just need to keep marking each other's up.
And I think it's also go back to the companies that we are investing, right? What do they need? How do we find the right partners for them to grow? And I think that's the composition of the board, the investors, the networks that we can offer and how we can help them scale. So for us, we often look at who else can be a good partner to this company as we move forward.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's exactly that. You need to find the purpose fit because there are many different investors. I think that the benefit of where we sit here today is there's many different investors in education and EdTech that weren't there before that are in the market to solve where you are in the where you are in the maturity of your company. So find the right investor for your company who brings the right value, and then think beyond that as you think about who else can partner with you down the road, right? So it is just like the evolution of the company, it's the evolution of your investor base and the evolution of the partnership model of who's best positioned alongside who you have today over time.
Yeah, and I see we're slightly over on time, so I think you said that brilliantly. From a KKR perspective, we tend to be kind of maybe the last investor that you would see, and then it's a public company, or perhaps it gets rolled into some even larger entity, et cetera. But I think the important thing, if you guys are in that stage of you're looking for your next investor, you should look at your next investor based on what they will bring and how they can help scale the business, not to top tick the value. I mean, because your value is when you ultimately exit, not when you post a mark. The second thing is that you should look not just at that round that you're doing, but who is that person and how do they position yourself for the next round if you need it? Because in most cases, the exact business plan doesn't work out, and you do end up needing more capital against an opportunity, even because the opportunity is greater. So I guess we will end with that, but thank you guys.
Thanks a lot, Richard.